Imagine stepping onto a high-speed train right on the Atlantic coast, like in Lisbon, Portugal.
Right.
And you sit down, and you literally do not get off until you hit the Pacific Ocean in Shanghai.
It's a long ride.
Yeah, it's a massive journey. But along the way, you pay for your coffee, your meals, your sleeper cabin, all using a single digital coin.
And not just any coin.
Exactly.
Mm.
Not a currency backed by gold or the U.S. Federal Reserve, but a coin backed by the combined megawatt output of like a Chinese solar farm and a Russian nuclear plant.
It sounds completely sci-fi.
It really does. But according to the source material we're looking at today, this isn't some distant science fiction scenario at all. It's actually the architectural blueprint of a new world order that's kind of being built right under our noses.
Yep, right as we speak.
So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we have a really fascinating mission. We are exploring a massive, slow-motion shift in global power.
And we're basing this on Kizzi Nkwocha's really eye-opening book, The Eurasian Century.
Right. And it's a blueprint coming into focus, not through, sudden dramatic treaties or wars, but through this quiet realignment of supply chains.
Energy grids, technology protocols, yeah.
Exactly. Nkwocha paints this picture of a world where the center of gravity is just moving irrevocably away from the Atlantic system.
And moving toward this vast, interconnected landmass of Eurasia.
So to start us off, he introduces this shift with a really striking anecdote, just to set the scene for you listening. Nkwocha describes sitting in a hotel room in Brussels, and he's watching a European minister on television.
Right, a career politician.
Yeah, a guy who has spent his entire life operating inside the safety of the post-World War II Western Alliance. But as he's speaking about the transatlantic partnership, the bedrock alliance between Europe and the U.S., he's parsing his words with this incredibly uncomfortable hesitation.
He's openly questioning the reliability of American security guarantees.
Exactly. He's asking, what might Europe be forced to do if Washington's umbrella suddenly just closes?
And the author notes that this minister's discomfort, it wasn't just like normal diplomatic caution. It was a visceral realization of vulnerability.
Yeah, you can see it.
When a career statesman starts questioning the structural foundation of his entire worldview on live TV, it signals that the underlying tectonic plates have already shifted.
And Nkwocha is uniquely positioned to spot those subtle tremors, because let's talk about his background for a second.
Yeah, it's super important context.
He's not, a traditional international relations academic sitting in some think tank in Washington or London.
Yeah.
His lens is completely different.
His lens was forged in collapse, honestly. Nkwocha was born in Nigeria, and he actually lived through the Nigeria-Biafra War as a refugee.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he spent his formative years experiencing the terrifying reality of institutional failure.
When you've actually watched the systems that govern daily life fall apart in front of you, you probably develop a really highly tuned sensitivity to those early warning signs of systemic decay.
Exactly. You know what a wobbling institution looks like. And later, he became a publisher, a media consultant, and a journalist. He represented heads of state and international organizations.
So he had access to the highest corridors of power.
Right. But he approaches those corridors with the skepticism of someone who inherently knows that order is fragile.
So he's not looking at this from the perspective of an empire trying to maintain its grip. He's looking at the raw mechanics of the systems themselves.
Yep.
Which brings us to the core premise we are unpacking today. The idea that the post-World War II Atlantic system, the one anchored by the United States, is actively losing its gravitational pull.
And the new center of the world is forming across that massive Eurasian landmass.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how a new operating system takes over, we really need to understand the source code of the old one. We have to look at the phrase in the Atlantic blueprint.
Right. The Atlantic system is what Nkwocha calls the furniture of reality.
The furniture of reality, I like that.
Yeah, it's so omnipresent that most of us, we don't even realize it was designed. We just think it's how the world works. But it was built in a very specific historical window.
Because in 1945, Europe was basically a graveyard.
Total devastation. The old balance of power diplomacy had failed catastrophically. Tens of millions dead. So the architects of the post-war world, primarily the US and the UK, they decided peace could only be achieved through a deeply entrenched dual-pillar architecture.
Okay, dual pillars, so defense and economics.
Exactly.
You lock the nations together militarily, and you fuse their bank accounts so they literally can't fight.
That was the theory, yeah. On the defense side, you get NATO in 1949, and NATO completely revolutionized geopolitical alliances with Article 5.
Right, the principle that an armed attack against one member is an attack against all.
Right. It effectively extended the borders of the United States all the way to the edge of Soviet-controlled East Germany.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. And the Berlin airlift in 1948 had already proved American logistical commitment, right? Flying supplies into a blockaded city around the clock. The security umbrella was absolute.
But a military alliance without an economic engine to sustain it, I mean, that eventually just bankrupts itself. You need commerce.
Which brings us to the second pillar, designed at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944.
Right, the economic architecture.
Yes, they created the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to manage currency crises. They built the World Bank to fund reconstruction. And JTT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to eliminate trade barriers.
And the U.S. dollar basically becomes the anchor of all global finance.
Exactly, because it was backed by the largest intact industrial base on Earth. And then through the Marshall Plan, the U.S. just pumped billions of dollars into European economies.
And the underlying logic there was inescapable. If German and French steel and coal industries are deeply physically integrated, they literally cannot manufacture the weapons to fight another war against each other.
It's an incredibly elegant piece of engineering, honestly. You create unprecedented wealth, and that wealth acts as the glue for the military alliance.
And it worked. I mean, it held the Soviet Union in check, it rebuilt Europe, and it basically created the modern middle class. So, if the machine is that well designed, why is that minister in Brussels sweating so much today?
Well, because machines degrade if they aren't adapted to their environment. And the environment changed drastically in 1991.
The collapse of the Soviet Union.
Right. The existential threat that justified NATO's rigid discipline just evaporated overnight. So the alliance entered a period of what Nkwocha terms strategic fatigue.
Strategic fatigue.
Yeah, for a decade, NATO was kind of searching for a unified purpose. They eventually found it after September 11th by invoking Article 5 for the first and only time.
Right, but that led to 20 years of counterinsurgency warfare in Afghanistan and the broader Middle East.
Which ended with the really chaotic withdrawal from Kabul in 2021.
And that fatigue isn't just military, is it? It's deeply political. You know, reading this, it reminded me of an old family business.
Oh, how so?
Well, imagine a wildly successful company where the founder, in this case the United States, built the empire, provided all the capital, and paid for everyone's security.
Okay, I'm following.
But then, 70 years later, the founder's kids, which would be Europe, are looking at the patriarch. And the patriarch is getting a bit erratic, making unilateral decisions, picking fights with the neighbors, threatening to cut off the kids' allowances.
Right.
At what point do the kids realize, wait, is this just normal political bickering? Or is the foundation actually cracking? Do we need to incorporate our own LLC?
That analogy tracks perfectly with the structural fractures Nkwocha actually outlines in the text. The friction isn't just rhetorical anymore, it's baked into policy.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, the 2003 invasion of Iraq was a massive early rupture. Washington pushed aggressively for military intervention, right? But core European allies, like France and Germany, explicitly refused to participate. So the U.S. just proceeded anyway, assembling a coalition of the willing. To Europe, this demonstrated that the U.S. would utilize the alliance when convenient, but completely ignore consensus when it wasn't.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the Iraq War was over 2 decades ago. The real alarm bells started ringing much more recently, particularly around trade.
Yes.
This is the part of the book that really stuck with me. The Trump administration's 2018 tariffs on European steel and aluminum.
The 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum.
Exactly. And, you know, trade spats happen all the time. The U.S. and Europe have fought over banana imports and aircraft subsidies for years. So why was the steel tariff a breaking point?
Because of the specific legal mechanism the U.S. invoked. Washington didn't just claim Europe was subsidizing steel unfairly. They utilized Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act.
Which does what, exactly?
It categorized European steel and aluminum imports as a national security threat.
Wow. You don't call your closest family member a national security threat?
Exactly the point. The rhetoric of national security is reserved for adversaries. By applying it to treaty-bound allies just to force trade concessions, the U.S. essentially signaled that the foundational trust of the Atlantic system was subordinate to America First economic interests.
Right. If the foundational guarantor of this system views your economic output as a security threat, The entire premise of Bretton Woods, that intertwined economies ensure mutual survival, begins to unravel completely.
And it wasn't isolated to trade either.
Right, there are other pullouts,
Yeah, you had the unilateral U.S. withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement.
which France, Germany, and the UK had spent years negotiating.
Decades, almost. They desperately tried to salvage it, too. They even set up special financial vehicles to try and bypass U.S. secondary sanctions, but American financial hegemony was just too strong. And then the U.S. also pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement.
Which sent a very clear message to European capitals.
Absolutely. The message was, American strategic reliability is no longer an institutional guarantee. It's a variable, and it's dependent entirely on the cyclical mood of the American electorate every 4 years.
And you cannot base a century-long continental security strategy on a 4-year political pendulum.
You really can't.
So Europe is staring down this terrifying security dilemma. They don't have a unified military command structure capable of fully replacing the U.S. umbrella. Their energy architecture was historically super dependent on Russia.
Right.
And if American attention pivots entirely to the Indo-Pacific to contain China, Europe is just left totally exposed.
And geopolitics abhors a vacuum. When the anchor to the west begins to drag, the immense gravitational pull of the east takes over, which transitions us perfectly from the fraying Atlantic blueprint to the geography that is quietly replacing it.
Yes,
Yeah.
because nature abhors a vacuum. As the Atlantic system wobbles, European leaders are quietly starting to look east. We have to look at the return of the heartland and the new Silk Grid.
Okay, so we're talking about a fundamental shift in how the world's goods physically move. And to understand this, the expert source pulls us way back to a theory from 1904.
1904.
Yeah. Halford Mackinder, a British geographer, he presented a paper to the Royal Geographical Society outlining the heartland theory.
And his core thesis was, who rules the heartland commands the world island.
Exactly. The world island being the contiguous landmass of Europe, Asia, and Africa.
Right.
Mackinder argued that the vast, inaccessible interior of Eurasia, stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to the borders of China, was the ultimate strategic pivot point of global history.
But for over a century, that theory was largely just academic.
Yeah.
It was ignored because it didn't match the technological reality of the time.
Exactly. The British Empire, and later the American Empire, ruled the world because they ruled the oceans. Maritime shipping was really the only efficient way to move massive quantities of goods. The interior of Eurasia was just too rugged, too vast, and too disconnected to serve as an economic engine.
Right. And that maritime dominance basically dictated the layout of the global economy. Coastal cities like New York, London, Shanghai, Tokyo, they become the hyper-wealthy nodes of globalization.
While the deep inland regions just languished.
But Nkwocha argues that modern technology and engineering have shattered that maritime monopoly.
Yes. The interior is no longer an impassable barrier. It is actively becoming a hyper-connected corridor.
The book talks about rail replacing sea. And honestly, here's where it gets really interesting. But I have to push back on the practicality of this for a second.
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, can trains really replace ocean freighters for global commerce? A massive modern container ship can hold over 20,000 TEUs, right? 20-foot containers. It's a floating skyscraper of cargo.
It is.
A freight train can maybe pull 100 containers. The math just simply doesn't support the idea that trains will bankrupt the maritime shipping industry.
Well, the objective isn't to replace maritime bulk capacity. It's not about volume in that sense. It's about altering the velocity, the security, and the geography of high-value trade.
Okay, so not iron ore.
Right, iron ore and grain will always travel by sea. But consider the logistics of high-value, time-sensitive manufacturing. Advanced electronics, automotive components, pharmaceuticals. A container ship from Shenzhen to Rotterdam takes roughly 30 to 40 days.
And it has to navigate narrow, strategically vulnerable choke points, like the Strait of Malacca or the Suez Canal.
Choke points that can be blockaded by a hostile navy or, blocked by a single sideways cargo ship, as we saw with the Ever Given in 2021.
Oh man, yeah, that completely paralyzed global trade for days.
Exactly. By contrast, a freight train traveling from Chongqing in western China, going across Kazakhstan, Russia, and Belarus, can reach Duisburg, Germany, in roughly 12 to 14 days.
Half the time.
Half the time. And it is entirely immune to naval blockades.
Wow. And Duisburg is a perfect example of this, isn't it?
It really is a geographical inversion. Duisburg is located at the confluence of the Rhine and Ruhr rivers in Germany's industrial heartland, and it has transformed into the world's largest inland port.
Because of the trains.
Yes. It acts as the primary European distribution node for the massive influx of rail cargo arriving from the east. Cities deep in the interior that were once economic backwaters are suddenly frontline hubs of global commerce.
But Ngosha clarifies that it's not just trains. He calls it the new Silk Grid. A grid implies multiple overlapping systems.
It's a multi-layered infrastructure stack. The physical rail and highway corridors are only the foundational layer. Layered directly alongside those tracks are massive fiber optic data cables.
Creating a continuous, high-bandwidth digital spine from the Pacific to the Atlantic.
Exactly. And intersecting both of those are the energy arteries. Pipelines moving Siberian natural gas to China and Central Asian oil to Europe and global markets.
And the management of this grid is increasingly automated, right? The text details how AI logistics systems are removing all the friction at the terminal nodes.
Oh, the automation is incredible. Look at the port of Piraeus in Greece.
Right, mention Piraeus.
Chinese state-owned enterprises invested heavily in Piraeus, transforming it into one of the busiest container ports in the Mediterranean, and it utilizes advanced AI to instantly coordinate the unloading of maritime cargo directly onto the rail networks, heading north into the Balkans and Eastern Europe.
It basically operates as a seamless continental operating system.
It does. And there is a massive external catalyst forcing this integration even faster than political ambition alone ever could.
Right.
The author brings in Naomi Klein's concept that climate change is a civilizational wake-up call.
This was such a fascinating structural argument to me.
Mm.
We so often talk about climate change as purely an environmental crisis, but Nkwocha frames it as an unavoidable unifier of supply chains.
It's the ultimate unifier.
Because if you accept that the transition away from fossil fuels is necessary for survival, you immediately realize you cannot execute that transition within the borders of a single nation state.
It doesn't respect borders. The green transition absolutely requires a synchronized continental ecosystem. Just look at the distribution of assets across Eurasia.
Okay, lay it out for me.
Europe possesses the regulatory framework, the political will, and the capital to mandate a rapid shift to renewable energy. However, they lack the raw materials and the manufacturing scale.
Right.
China, conversely, absolutely dominates the global production of solar panels, wind turbines, and the refinement of critical minerals for battery storage.
And sitting directly between them is Central Asia and Russia, holding vast reserves of the critical minerals. The raw lithium, copper, rare earth elements required to build all this hardware.
Exactly. You literally cannot build a European wind farm or transition to an electric vehicle fleet without the technology manufactured in Shenzhen and the metals mined in Kazakhstan.
Climate change doesn't care about ideological differences. It simply mandates industrial interdependence.
But an interdependent spine stretching from Portugal to the Pacific isn't being built in a peaceful vacuum.
No, it generates intense geopolitical friction.
When you rewire the world's energy and supply chains, the old beneficiaries push back and the new vulnerabilities become acute. So to understand if this nascent Eurasian system can actually survive its own complexity, we have to look at its biggest stress test and its earliest prototype.
Right. We need to examine the flashpoints and the flexible networks. And there is no pressure point on the globe more critical right now than Taiwan.
It is the systemic flashpoint.
Now, a quick note for our listeners. We are relaying the author's structural analysis here, looking at the mechanics of the global supply chain. We are absolutely not endorsing any political side of this conflict. We are just looking at the reality on the ground.
Right, maintaining strict neutrality on the politics. Structurally, Taiwan is where the concepts of national sovereignty, military deterrence, and the modern digital economy violently intersect.
And the ultimate leverage point is semiconductors.
Specifically, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. They produce a staggering percentage of the world's most advanced microchips. And we aren't just talking about the chips in your smartphone.
Right, we are talking about the sub-5 nanometer chips. The ones that power artificial intelligence data centers, advanced fighter jets, and those automated logistics grids we just discussed.
I think people hear microchips and think, well, if there's a crisis, Europe or the US can just build their own factories in a few months.
Yeah, just spin up a plant in Ohio.
But the book makes it clear that the technological moat is incredibly deep. You need extreme ultraviolet lithography machines from ASML in the Netherlands. You need specialized chemicals from Japan.
And you need the institutional engineering knowledge that Taiwan has spent decades concentrating in a few very specific science parks, You cannot replicate that ecosystem in Ohio or Bavaria in a few years.
Which means a kinetic conflict or a severe blockade over Taiwan wouldn't just be a regional tragedy. It would induce an immediate, catastrophic halt to the global economy.
Everything stops.
Everything. And this creates a brutal strategic dilemma for Europe.
And Nkwocha lays this out perfectly. If a crisis erupts across the Taiwan Strait, Washington will almost certainly demand that its European allies impose devastating, comprehensive sanctions on China, mirroring or even exceeding the response to Russia.
But European leaders know that instantly severing the deeply integrated supply chains with China would plunge the European economy into a crippling depression.
So it forces a choice they desperately want to avoid. Do they align entirely with the U.S. to protect the old order? Do they protect trade with China for their own economic survival? Or do they try to walk this impossible middle path and act as a mediator?
It is the ultimate stress test for an integrated Eurasia. If a Taiwan crisis fragments the global supply chain into hostile, isolated blocks, the new Silk Grid shatters.
Oh, but while Taiwan represents the fragility of the system, the host, the author points to another development that represents the desire for systemic resilience. Countries are actively building alternatives.
Yes.
Which brings us to the evolution of BRICS. The analogy I kept coming back to while reading this section is the difference between software ecosystems.
Oh, I like this. Go on.
If the Atlantic system, NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, is like a closed ecosystem tech product, like Apple. It's highly integrated, very effective, but incredibly rigid.
The U.S. sets the rules, controls the App Store, and if you violate their terms of service, you are locked out of the global financial system.
Right, exactly. The threat of financial exclusion, being cut off from this SWIFT payment system, or facing secondary dollar sanctions, is the ultimate stick the U.S. wields.
So how does BRICS fit into this?
BRICS, in contrast, feels much more like an open-source platform. Originally, it was just an acronym, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But the book notes its recent massive expansion.
Right, to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran.
And that expansion completely changes the geopolitical math. You are combining the world's largest manufacturing bases with the world's most critical energy producers.
But returning to your open source analogy, if BRICS is an open protocol, it's fair to ask, who are the lead developers and are they even writing the same code? Because India and China have active, militarized border disputes in the Himalayas, they are fierce strategic rivals. They certainly do not share a unified political vision.
Which is exactly why they aren't trying to build a Eurasian NATO. An open source protocol doesn't require everyone to like each other. It just requires them to agree on the base layer of communication.
And that base layer agreement is simple. They want options outside the US dollar. They want to eliminate the single point of failure.
We see this mechanically in the creation of the new development bank, headquartered in Shanghai.
Right. It was explicitly designed as an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF, providing infrastructure and development loans without the strict macroeconomic conditionalities that Western institutions historically impose.
And we're seeing these quiet moves to settle trade in local currencies, like Saudi Arabia being open to trading oil in Chinese renminbi.
They aren't trying to overthrow the dollar tomorrow. They are building a financial redundant system.
But BRICS, in its current form, is a loose association. It proves countries want alternatives. But for a true Eurasian superstate to function, it needs far more than a loose network. It needs entirely new foundational institutions.
Which brings us to one of the most provocative sections of the book, the architecture of a superstate: capital, currency, and governance.
Let's start with the physical symbol of power, the bridge capital. Because you can't run a neutral continental grid from London or Beijing or Moscow. They carry way too much national baggage.
The geography of administration matters immensely. A capital city signals who owns the system. For a smaller country in Central Asia or Eastern Europe, being ruled from Beijing just feels like imperialism under a different name.
So building a neutral center. Nkwocha synthesizes several possibilities for this. One approach is the bridge city. Istanbul is arguably the most historically resonant option here.
It physically straddles the European and Asian continents across the Bosporus. It has a millennia-long legacy of connecting East and West.
Another option the text explores is Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan. It's a purpose-built, hypermodern city located in the dead center of the Eurasian landmass.
It physically embodies the pivot away from the coasts and into the heartland.
But the author also entertains a much more radical architectural solution,
Yes, the construction of an entirely new, purpose-built capital city situated near the Ural Mountains,
Because the Urals serve as the traditional geographic dividing line between Europe and Asia.
placing the administrative hub directly on that seam, much like Washington, D.C. was placed between the north and south, or Brasilia was carved out of the interior, sends a very deliberate signal. It belongs to neither the east nor the west. It is the synthesis of both.
But, a capital city is just concrete and glass. To manage the metabolism of an entire continent, you need a mechanism of exchange.
You need money.
So what does this all mean for money? I'm leaning in here because this part is wild.
Yeah.
If the U.S. dollar derives its power from the American military and the legacy of the petrodollar, what backs the currency of Eurasia?
The author introduces a fascinating theoretical framework for a digital currency called the euro,
The euro.
and it represents a fundamental departure from both traditional fiat currency and speculative cryptocurrencies. The euro would be a digital energy currency.
Okay, let's really break down the mechanics of this because it sounds crazy at first. You are tying the value of a digital coin directly to continental energy production. Why energy?
Because energy is the inescapable base layer of all economic output. You cannot manufacture a solar panel, run an AI data center, or move a high-speed train without consuming energy.
Right.
While fiat currency relies on the perceived credibility of a central bank, energy has absolute physical intrinsic value. And Eurasia contains unmatched energy diversity.
Immense oil and gas reserves in Russia and the Gulf, robust nuclear infrastructure in France and Eastern Europe, and massive renewable generation capacity in China.
The euro creates a unified metric for all of it. 1 kilowatt hour equals a unit of value. 1 unit of the euro represents a verifiable claim on a specific unit of usable energy.
But if I'm a central banker running the Eurasian Central Bank, this sounds like an absolute nightmare to manage.
Oh, structurally, it's incredibly complex.
With fiat currency, if my economy slows down, I lower interest rates and print money to stimulate growth. You can't print a barrel of oil. You can't legislate the wind to blow harder.
No, you can't.
So if Europe has a freezing windless winter and Chinese hydro dams experience a drought, does the energy supply drop, causing massive paralyzing deflation across the continent? Like the Greek debt crisis, but for electricity.
That is precisely the mechanical vulnerability. You are shifting the core competency of central banking from monetary theory to physics and engineering.
Wow.
In an energy-backed currency system, your gold reserves are your baseload power plants, nuclear and hydro, that provide constant output.
Yeah.
And your bank vaults are massive grid-scale battery installations and pumped hydro storage facilities.
You manage inflation and deflation by managing energy storage and distribution efficiency, not by adjusting interest rates.
So a transaction in this system is literally a transfer of energy rights. Say a German automotive factory needs to buy refined lithium from Kazakhstan.
Okay.
They execute a smart contract using the euro. The digital token they send is essentially a cryptographically secured voucher for a megawatt of power generated by a Chinese solar farm, which the Kazakh mining company can then redeem to power its excavation equipment.
It's an entirely closed, self-sustaining loop.
It's an elegant theoretical model, but it requires a level of data integration that is almost incomprehensible. The Eurasian Central Bank would need real-time algorithmic control over the entire continental grid to balance the ledger.
Which introduces the dark side of this architecture, the bureaucratic shadow.
Technocrats versus politicians.
Exactly. When a system reaches this level of technical complexity, managing energy-backed digital currencies, routing autonomous freight trains, and balancing a transcontinental power grid, human politicians become essentially obsolete.
You can't debate the physics of grid balancing in a parliament.
Right. Power inevitably shifts to the technical experts, the technocrats.
It's a structural necessity. You need specialized engineers, data scientists, and AI models to run the infrastructure. But this exacerbates a profound tension between efficiency and democratic accountability.
Because technocrats prioritize optimization.
Always. They view friction like public debate, labor strikes, or local environmental protests against a new transmission line as system errors to be bypassed.
So here's a pointed question. if the engineers are making all the real decisions about our digital IDs and energy quotas,
Uh,
where does democracy actually fit in?
It's the ultimate democratic deficit. If an algorithmic central bank decides to lower my region's energy quota to stabilize the currency.
Or if a logistics AI reroutes a supply chain away from my city because it found a path that is 2% more efficient.
I have no recourse. I can't vote out an algorithm. We cease to be active citizens participating in a republic. We just become end users of a continental operating system subject to its terms of service.
That is terrifying.
And historically, when populations feel that a system is hyper-efficient but entirely unaccountable to their lived experience, they eventually revolt, regardless of how fast the trains run.
But internal dissent isn't the only threat this superstate would face. Protecting an incredibly complex, interconnected grid of energy, data, and digital currency requires a completely different approach to warfare.
You can't just put tanks on a border anymore.
Right, which pulls us into Section 5, the Shield of Eurasia and the AI battlefield, protecting systems, not just borders.
Traditional territorial defense, the NATO model of armored divisions defending lines on a map, becomes secondary. The Shield of Eurasia would operate as a layered network defense system.
Prioritizing the protection of the connective tissue itself.
Exactly, focusing heavily on shared missile defense and cyber defense to protect infrastructure corridors. The primary threats are no longer infantry invasions. They are cyber attacks that could sever the digital arteries, or precision strikes that take out an energy node.
A successful hack on the AI managing the port of Shanghai, or the Euros clearinghouse, could paralyze the continent faster than a strategic bombing campaign, which means the speed of warfare fundamentally changes.
Yes. The text discusses the terrifying shift toward intelligentized warfare.
Intelligentized warfare, AI, and the loss of human delay.
This is perhaps the most sobering mechanical shift in the entire book. Throughout the history of conflict, survival often relied on the human pause.
The human pause.
Yeah. When early warning radars detected a potential threat during the Cold War, there was a window of time, minutes or hours, where analysts reviewed the data, generals conferred, and political leaders weighed the catastrophic consequences of retaliation.
That friction allowed cooler heads to prevail and prevented accidental apocalypse.
But AI compresses the sensor-to-shooter loop to milliseconds. An AI system can analyze satellite feeds, detect a heat signature, classify a threat, and calculate a firing solution before a human operator has even processed the image on a screen.
In a hyper-connected conflict, speed equals dominance.
If you mandate that a human must manually authorize every strike, your defense systems will be overwhelmed by an adversary whose algorithms are allowed to fire autonomously.
The tactical advantage forces both sides to hand over operational control to the machines. You are effectively removing that human pause from the escalation ladder.
It's a terrifying thought.
It's exactly like high-frequency algorithmic stock trading, but for weapons. Where competing AI programs react to each other in fractions of a second, occasionally causing a flash crash that drops the market thousands of points before humans can hit the kill switch.
But applied to warfare, a flash crash means a city burns. Everything moves faster than human comprehension.
And the text highlights a really interesting example here to show that AI is not a neutral tool. It mentions a recent dispute between the Pentagon and Anthropic, an AI company.
Right, underscoring that AI models contain embedded biases, ethical constraints, and logic trees defined by their developers. When you put those models in charge of lethal force, those hidden constraints dictate life and death.
And we are already seeing the democratization of this automated lethality through cheap drones. The book cites the conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh and the Russia-Ukraine war.
Drone swarms are changing everything. Cheap, commercial-grade drones, organized into autonomous swarms, can systematically dismantle expensive traditional armored columns. You are no longer fighting a discrete weapon. You are fighting a self-healing, adaptive network that overwhelms air defenses through sheer volume.
So you have a military reality where AI systems and drone swarms are fighting hyper-fast, localized conflicts over infrastructure nodes. But there's a ceiling on this, right?
Yes, the presence of nuclear weapons, nuclear ceilings.
Right.
Eurasia contains a dense concentration of nuclear-armed states.
Yeah.
Russia, China, France, the UK, India, and Pakistan. The fundamental logic of mutually assured destruction remains intact.
Direct, full-scale conventional warfare between these powers risks escalating to a nuclear exchange, which is systemically suicidal.
So that nuclear ceiling imposes a strategic limit that forces countries to cooperate, or at least compete in the shadows, below that threshold. They wage cyber warfare, they fund proxies, but direct conflict is too catastrophic.
It's an incredibly volatile way to manage a continent. And, it's one thing to build an automated defense shield and a digital currency. It is entirely another to get incredibly diverse populations to actually trust each other.
Which is the perfect pivot to our next section: culture, values, and the in-between states.
You can engineer the infrastructure, but you cannot mathematically engineer cultural cohesion. And Europe's identity question is a huge part of this. The book brings up cultural resistance to integration, using Brexit as a primary example.
Right, from a purely technocratic supply chain perspective, Britain leaving the European Union was deeply irrational.
Nkwocha frames it as a profound strategic miscalculation.
He does, because the UK voluntarily erected massive trade barriers with its largest economic partner, added crippling friction to its logistics networks, and forfeited its ability to write the regulations that govern the continent.
But Brexit wasn't driven by supply chain logic. It was driven by the emotive power of identity and the desire for sovereign control, even if that control was largely perceived rather than actual.
It proves that populations will deliberately choose economic pain if they feel their cultural identity or political autonomy is being erased by a distant, faceless bureaucracy. Now, magnify that friction across the entire Eurasian landmass.
Which brings us to the unavoidable elephant in the room, the human rights friction. And again, strict neutrality here. We're just looking at the structural clash of values outlined in the text.
The EU's entire post-war identity is legally anchored in the primacy of individual human rights and transparent rule of law.
While China's system, managed by the CCP, is structurally anchored in the primacy of state stability, long-term planning, and collective order.
These are not minor policy disagreements. They are fundamentally incompatible operating systems for human society. And this ideological collision creates constant friction on the geopolitical layer.
Like the sanctions over Xinjiang.
Exactly. When the EU imposes sanctions on Chinese officials over Xinjiang or issues formal condemnations regarding the national security law in Hong Kong, Beijing views this as a deliberate violation of its internal sovereignty.
And China inevitably retaliates with counter-sanctions, targeting European politicians and research institutes. So my question is, can you actually share an integrated economy with someone if you fundamentally disagree on basic human rights?
The author notes this is an unavoidable tension that must be managed through pragmatic coexistence. Convergence is a fantasy. The EU and China are not going to adopt each other's values.
But complete decoupling is economic suicide.
Therefore, the relationship becomes transactional. They cooperate deeply on climate technology, they integrate their rail networks, but they accept a state of permanent ideological friction.
And while Europe and China try to balance that scale, Russia's dilemma is profound. The text calls it the junior partner problem.
Historically, Russia has always perceived itself as a peer European great power, a civilizational pole.
But as Europe cuts energy ties, Russia is forced to turn to China.
And structurally, it risks becoming a subordinate resource provider. China's economy and demographic weight dwarf Russia's. The fear within Russian strategic circles is that they provide the discount hydrocarbons, while China dictates the terms of the relationship.
It's a deeply uncomfortable demotion for a nation obsessed with sovereignty. But most fascinating maneuvering is happening in the fault lines. The map movers.
Yes, the states operating in the spaces between the giants. Let's touch on Central Asia's brilliant multi-vector policy, playing all sides to their advantage.
Like Kazakhstan.
Exactly. They accept massive infrastructure investments from China, but they court Western energy conglomerates to develop their oil fields, ensuring everyone has a vested interest in their stability.
And Turkey plays a powerful role as a gatekeeper of the Bosporus.
Geography grants Turkey ultimate leverage. They physically control access between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So they are a NATO member, but they buy missile defense systems from Russia and maintain deep trade ties everywhere.
They extract concessions from everyone because everyone needs access to their geography.
Hmm.
And then you have the Pacific counterweight, Japan and South Korea.
They embody the central paradox perfectly. Economically, their survival is inextricably tethered to China, but technologically and militarily, they are anchored entirely to the United States.
If the Eurasian integration forces a binary choice, Tokyo and Seoul face an almost unsolvable strategic crisis.
And we absolutely cannot discuss the future of a Eurasian century without acknowledging the external frontier that will fuel it: Africa.
The demographic explosion in Africa is staggering. By 2050, it's projected that 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. It is the only region with a massively expanding young workforce.
While Europe, Russia, and China face severe demographic stagnation.
But it's not just labor. It's the critical resources.
Yeah.
Cobalt, lithium. The green transition doesn't happen without Africa. And the strategies employed to secure these resources are distinctly different.
Contrast China's hard infrastructure belt and road investments like the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway with Europe's global gateway strategy.
China offers loans with a policy of non-interference. They build the port, no political lecturing required.
While the European approach is heavily tied to strict conditionalities regarding sustainability, governance, and human rights, Africa is increasingly able to dictate the terms of engagement between the two.
Which brings us to the final synthesizing reality of this entire deep dive. With all of this economic, digital, and infrastructural power shifting toward Eurasia and Africa, what happens to America?
What is left for the country that used to run the board?
Exactly.
The author synthesizes this final reality clearly. America doesn't collapse, but it experiences a demotion.
Right, it doesn't vanish. It remains incredibly wealthy and militarily lethal.
But it goes from being the default operating system of the world to simply being a choice.
The era of American unipolarity ends as the Eurasian system no longer organizes itself around Washington. It becomes a multipolar reality. And reflecting on the everyday lived experience of this, as a citizen of two continents, if this works, you are looking at a world of frictionless digital identity, borderless high-speed travel, shared continental education,
Unprecedented physical and digital connection managed by unimaginably complex systems.
which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up today. If our money is backed by continental energy, our identities are managed by AI, and our trade relies on a transcontinental digital grid.
Will the very concept of a nation-state eventually feel as outdated as a medieval walled city?
Exactly. Are we moving toward a future where we aren't citizens of countries anymore, but just users of a continental operating system? It's wild to think about.
The next few decades will definitely reveal if our political identities can adapt.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really encourage you to keep looking beneath the surface of the news to see the grand shifts in the global tectonic plates.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.